On September 17, 1943, 12 British commandos boarded a Halifax bomber at a remote airbase near Cairo, embarking on a mission cloaked in secrecy. The orders came directly from Winston Churchill to land deep behind enemy lines in German-occupied Yugoslavia and forge an alliance with the communist resistance, led by the formidable Josip Broz Tito. At the helm of this daring operation was Churchill's hand-picked envoy, a soldier, politician, and aristocrat, Fitzroy Maclean. Despite their stark ideological differences, Tito, a staunch Bolshevik, and Maclean, a fierce conservative, their mutual hatred for a common enemy made cooperation not only possible but essential. Churchill and Maclean, however, were gambling with history. By siding with Tito, they risked empowering a leader who could transform Yugoslavia into a totalitarian regime. Yet the alternative seemed even grimmer. This is the story of a wartime gamble that defied the odds. How a Scottish conservative aristocrat and a ruthless communist formed one of the unlikeliest alliances in history. Together, Maclean and Tito galvanized the resistance, playing a pivotal role in the Allied victory in the Balkans and reshaping post-war Europe. Tito would go on to lead a stable, independent Yugoslavia for over 3 decades, while Fitzroy Maclean earned his place as a key figure in the shadowy world of the Secret War. The roots of this alliance trace back to April 6, 1941, when Axis forces from Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, and Hungary launched a brutal invasion of Yugoslavia. Within just 2 weeks, 17,000 civilians were dead. The Yugoslav army had crumbled, and fear cast a long shadow over the nation. In the Montenegrin town of Cetinje, young Bato Tomasevich recalled the terrifying sound of approaching planes. Rushing outside with his brother and a schoolmate, he watched as tiny black dots fell from the sky bombs. The explosions struck their courtyard. While Bato and his brother survived, their friend was not so fortunate, disappearing in the blast. Yugoslavia, a fragile state born from the ashes of World War I, was a patchwork of diverse ethnicities, religions, and languages, a volatile mix ripe for exploitation. Hitler capitalized on these deep divisions. Some groups, like the Croats, welcomed the German occupiers, while others, particularly the Serbs loyal to their exiled king, faced persecution and terror. The Nazis dismantled the country, establishing an independent Croatian state and dividing the rest among Axis powers. The Yugoslav government and King Peter II fled to Britain, ruling from exile. But not all chose to run. One man who stayed was Serbian Colonel Draza Mihailovic. A master of guerrilla tactics, he retreated to the mountains, rallying a band of fighters to wage a relentless campaign against the Germans. Another figure who refused to flee was Josip Broz, better known as Tito, an alias meaning do this, do that. Born to a Croatian family, Tito's military prowess was matched by his political ambition. After distinguished service, he embraced communism, spending years in Moscow, where Stalin himself appointed him Secretary General of the Yugoslav Communist Party in 1937. Following the German invasion, Tito received orders from Moscow: disrupt the Nazi war machine in Yugoslavia to aid the Soviet cause. He began assembling a formidable guerrilla force drawn from all corners of the fractured nation. By late 1941, Tito's partisans had grown to 80,000 strong, headquartered in the forests near the town of Kraljevo. Meanwhile, 120 miles to the east, Mihailovic was building his royalist Chenik army in the Serbian highlands of Ravna Gora, determined to restore the monarchy. His forces, steeped in a tradition of guerrilla warfare dating back to the Ottoman occupation, were fiercely loyal to Serbia's royal legacy. Yugoslavia now had 2 major anti-German resistance movements. For Churchill and his war cabinet, the natural choice seemed clear: support Mihailovic, a royalist who despised communism as much as they did. But the situation on the ground grew increasingly complex. Tensions between the Chetniks and partisans escalated into open conflict, igniting a brutal civil war within a war. As royalists and communists turned their guns on each other, thousands perished, not at the hands of the Nazis, but their fellow countrymen. This was the volatile landscape into which Fitzroy Maclean parachuted. tasked with making a fateful decision that would shape the future of Yugoslavia and Europe itself. During the brutal winters of World War II, an unsettling truth emerged in Yugoslavia. More Yugoslavs were being killed by their own countrymen than by German forces. The Germans, exploiting the chaos, advanced with little resistance, seizing ground from both sides. News of the civil conflict quickly reached London, where the Yugoslav government in exile pleaded with the British to support Colonel Draza Mihailovic, the royalist guerrilla leader. Initially, this seemed the most logical course of action, until two critical pieces of intelligence changed everything. In Cairo, Egypt, the British intelligence headquarters for the Balkans was under the watchful eye of Colonel Keble. When Winston Churchill arrived in January 1943 to meet with Allied leaders, Keble presented a startling report. His findings suggested that Mihailovic's Chetniks were not only ineffective against the Germans, but also alarmingly complacent. In stark contrast, Keble proposed that perhaps the communist partisans, under Josip Broz Tito, might be the stronger force. The second, and perhaps most decisive, blow came from Bletchley Park in Britain, where elite codebreakers intercepted German military communications using the captured Enigma machines. This classified intelligence, known as Ultra, revealed a damning reality. Mihailovic's forces were collaborating with the Italians, and the Germans showed little concern about his operations. Tito, however, was a different story. The intercepted messages made it clear the Nazis were terrified of him. His partisans were relentless, inflicting significant casualties on German troops. Faced with this stark evidence, Churchill made a bold and controversial decision. Britain would shift its support from Mihailovic to Tito. Despite the Soviet Union's indifference toward aiding Tito's cause, the British government resolved to provide the partisans with full-scale assistance. Yet there was one significant problem. Churchill knew little about Tito or his partisans. Could a communist leader truly be trusted? Churchill confided in his foreign secretary, stating, "What we need is a daring ambassador to lead among these hardy and hunted guerrillas." The man chosen for this mission was Captain Fitzroy Maclean. Maclean was perhaps the least likely candidate to negotiate with a communist. Born on March 11, 1911, into one of Scotland's oldest Highland families, his lineage was steeped in military tradition, tracing back to the Jacobite Rebellion. The Maclean family motto proudly declared, "Thank God I am a Maclean." Educated at Eton, Maclean later attended Cambridge, where he studied Latin, Greek, and German. Upon graduating, he had countless career paths at his disposal, but chose the prestigious British diplomatic service. After passing the entrance exam with distinction in 1933, he secured his first posting in Paris, a city that would profoundly shape his worldview. There, as a young diplomat, Maclean mingled with influential political figures, including Winston Churchill, forging connections that would later alter the course of history. While Paris exposed Maclean to the vibrancy of European diplomacy, it also ignited a fascination with Russian affairs. Frequent encounters with émigrés fleeing Stalin's oppressive regime deepened his interest, compelling him to request a posting in Moscow. His colleagues thought he was reckless, but Maclean's curiosity was insatiable. Arriving in Moscow during Stalin's Great Purge, Maclean witnessed the Soviet Union at its most brutal. He attended the infamous 9-day show trial of Nikolai Bukharin, once a close ally of Lenin, who was ultimately executed along with thousands of others. The experience left Maclean with a visceral hatred for communism. His disillusionment grew when, in August 1939, he watched the Soviet capital buzz with eerie activity, the harbinger of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The world was stunned as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression treaty. A secret clause allowed them to carve up Poland, setting the stage for World War II. When Hitler invaded Poland from the west, Stalin's Red Army attacked from the east. Britain and France declared war on Germany, and Maclean, desperate to fight, raced back to London. However, as a Foreign Office official, he was barred from military service. Determined, he found a loophole. By running for Parliament, he would be forced to resign his diplomatic post. Churchill, upon hearing of Maclean's clever maneuver, Riley remarked that he had used the Mother of Parliaments as a public convenience. With his resignation secured, Maclean enlisted in the Cameron Highlanders, his father's old regiment, and soon joined the elite Special Air Service, SAS, in North Africa. His daring spirit, diplomatic acumen, and first-hand experience with communism made him Churchill's ideal envoy, a man uniquely suited to navigate the treacherous political landscape of Yugoslavia. Thus began one of the most extraordinary missions of the war, a conservative Scottish aristocrat tasked with forging an alliance with a ruthless communist guerrilla leader. It was a gamble, but one that would change the course of history. In July 1943, Fitzroy Maclean was summoned to London by none other than Winston Churchill. Having recently been promoted to brigadier, Maclean was driven to the Prime Minister's country estate, Chequers, nestled in the tranquil hills of Buckinghamshire. There, in a private meeting that would alter the course of history, Churchill was direct and unequivocal about Maclean's mission: to uncover the true identity of Josip Broz Tito and earn his trust. I asked, "What is the purpose of my mission?" Maclean later recalled. Churchill replied, "First and foremost, it's military, to find out, quite simply, who is killing the most Germans and how we can help them kill more." When Maclean pressed about the political implications of working with communists, Churchill dismissed them with characteristic bluntness. They are secondary. Even as they spoke, events across Europe made Maclean's mission increasingly urgent. In the summer of 1943, the Allies captured the strategic island of Sicily, triggering a domino effect that rocked the Axis powers. Italy surrendered on September 8th, becoming the first of Germany's allies to capitulate. Italian troops across Yugoslavia laid down their arms, retreating hastily and abandoning vast stockpiles of weapons and supplies. Tito's partisans wasted no time, seizing the armaments of 10 entire Italian divisions. Now, Tito's army was bristling with modern military hardware, an irresistible asset for the Allies. All they needed was coordination and leadership. The very next day, Maclean parachuted into Yugoslavia with an elite team of 11 engineers, sappers, soldiers, and intelligence officers. The drop was flawless, landing them squarely in partisan-held territory. Tito, well informed of their arrival, had dispatched an escort with horses. After a grueling 2-hour ride deep into the rugged Bosnian hills, Maclean's team ascended a narrow track to the ruins of an ancient castle overlooking the town of Jace. It was there that Maclean would finally meet the enigmatic man who had become both a mystery and a legend in the eyes of the world. Tito, in those days, was a shadowy figure. Maclean later recounted in 1964. Some said he was a committee. Others claimed he was a young woman. Some even believed he didn't exist at all. But what I found was a tough, determined middle-aged man who, without any outside help, had built from nothing not just a guerrilla force, but a formidable political and military machine. Maclean's mission was clear: determine if Tito and his partisans could be reliable allies in the fight against the Germans. He maintained regular correspondence with Churchill, sending detailed reports of his progress. From the very beginning, it was evident that Tito was someone Maclean could work with. As a personality, I found Tito much easier to get along with than most communists I'd met in Russia and elsewhere, Maclean observed. He made no secret of his communist beliefs. On the contrary, he reveled in them. But for a communist, he was remarkably pragmatic, willing to see both sides of an argument, and capable of making swift decisions without deferring to higher authority. He struck me as someone entirely self-assured, a leader, not a subordinate. As their partnership grew, so did Maclean's respect for Tito. Despite their ideological chasm, Maclean admired Tito's breadth of vision, sharp independence of thought, and unyielding sense of humor, even amid the grim realities of war. He had an unashamed delight in life's small pleasures, Maclean noted, and an intense national pride that resonated with every one of his followers. Maclean's reports back to London carried a staggering revelation. Tito's partisans had swelled to nearly 250,000 fighters, by far the largest resistance force in Europe. But the critical question remained: could they fight effectively? The Allies were desperate to find out. By late 1943, the Allied advance in Italy was grinding northward, met with fierce German resistance. The supreme Allied commander in Italy, General Sir Maitland Wilson, nicknamed Jumbo, sent an urgent message to Maclean. The Trieste-Ljubljana Railway was a vital supply line for German forces in Italy. Wilson's directive was clear: get Tito's partisans to sever that lifeline. Maclean and Tito personally handpicked a team of fighters for the mission. The railway was heavily fortified, but the partisans, fueled by determination and guided by Maclean's strategic acumen, fought their way through fierce German defenses. They set their charges with precision. The result was devastating. The railway supply line was crippled, disrupting German logistics for weeks. The operation was a resounding success, proving the partisans' capability as a formidable fighting force. Their achievement did not go unnoticed. On December 1, 1943, the leaders of the Allied powers, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, gathered for the historic Tehran Conference. High on their agenda was the situation in Yugoslavia. The so-called Big Three reached a unanimous decision to provide Tito's partisans with full-scale support. 9 days later, Churchill flew from Tehran to Cairo. Waiting for him was Fitzroy Maclean. Churchill relayed the Tehran decision to intensify support for Tito, marking a pivotal shift in Allied strategy. But Maclean, ever the realist, expressed his concerns. I said that I had no doubt that the partisans would. Here, the narrative would naturally continue with Maclean's reflections on the potential political consequences and the unfolding dynamics between Tito, the Allies, and post-war Yugoslavia. As Fitzroy Maclean voiced his concerns about the post-war political future of Yugoslavia, Winston Churchill cut him off with his signature bluntness. "Do you intend to make Yugoslavia your home after the war?" Churchill asked. "Do you intend to live there?" Maclean replied, "No." Churchill leaned in and delivered his verdict. "Well, neither do I. So, had we not better leave it to the Yugoslavs to decide what kind of regime they want?" Armed with this clarity, Maclean returned to Yugoslavia with a renewed mission to rearm and motivate the partisans and drive the Germans out of the country. This time, he wasn't alone. Accompanying him was Randolph Churchill, Winston's son. Maclean had specifically requested Randolph's presence, trusting his endurance, determination, and sharp intellect. Randolph's participation wasn't just a gesture of camaraderie. It was a symbol, a personal pledge from Winston Churchill to Tito, signaling Britain's unwavering commitment to the partisan cause. Tito, it seemed, was genuinely touched by this gesture. Maclean's first order of business was to prepare the partisans for large-scale Allied support. He instructed them to secure safe landing strips for incoming supply planes. Bato Tomasevich, a young partisan fighter, was part of one of the 18 teams tasked with constructing these improvised airstrips. "Our job was to cut wood during the day and arrange it so we could light bonfires at midnight when British transport planes would arrive," Tomasevich recalled. Meanwhile, in Italy, Allied supply convoys rolled into secret airfields, loaded with equipment destined for Yugoslavia. American and British forces coordinated with partisan guerrillas to establish an efficient, clandestine supply line. The scale of the operation stunned the partisans. In just 2 nights, they received more supplies than Mihailovic's Chetniks had managed to secure in 2 years. Within weeks, British and American aircraft had delivered an astonishing arsenal: 100,000 rifles, 50,000 machine guns, 1,318 mortars, over 600,000 grenades, nearly 100 million rounds of ammunition, 700 radio sets, and 250,000 pairs of boots. Along with uniforms, food, and medical supplies, these shipments carried something even more valuable: recognition. The partisans were now officially acknowledged as Britain's allies. "I was dressed in an English uniform, carrying a British machine gun," Tomasevich proudly recounted. With American involvement came the inevitable wave of propaganda. Film crews followed the partisans everywhere, capturing images of men and women fighting side by side. The Yugoslav resistance, once a shadowy underground force, was now portrayed as heroic and glamorous across Allied media. But not everyone was pleased. Colonel Draza Mihailovic, the royalist leader still clinging to his dwindling Chetnik forces, grew increasingly desperate. Hoping to regain British favor, he ordered an attack on a key German supply line, the railway to Greece. A British agent embedded with his unit captured footage of a successful bridge demolition. But the operation backfired spectacularly when the credit was mistakenly attributed to Tito's partisans. Emboldened by his rising influence, Tito established the National Council of Liberation, positioning it as a rival government to the Yugoslav government in exile in London. He appointed himself Marshal of Yugoslavia, solidifying his role as the supreme military commander. Recognizing the political shift, Maclean cautiously broached the topic of Yugoslavia's post-war future. Tito's initial assurances were comforting. As a telegram to Churchill confirmed, Tito claimed he had no intention of merging Yugoslavia into the Soviet Union or adopting Soviet economic models. With British confidence in Tito solidified, all official contact with Mihailovic's Chetniks was severed. For Mihailovic, it was a devastating blow. Abandoned by the Allies, many of his disillusioned followers defected to the Germans. Ironically, this betrayal provided Churchill with further justification for having distanced Britain from Mihailovic in the first place. By the spring of 1944, the mission in Yugoslavia had evolved from supply operations to full-scale military collaboration. The Yugoslav partisans were granted their own air force under the banner of the RAF Balkan Air Force, composed of 15 different types of Allied aircraft, including the iconic Spitfires. Air superiority became a game changer. At the center of this transformation was Fitzroy Maclean, now responsible for coordinating all bomber and fighter operations. With air power at his disposal, Maclean could not only expedite supply drops, but also execute precision strikes against key German targets. Reflecting on this period, he later remarked that the Air Force provided an incalculable advantage in achieving rapid results. The balance of power in Yugoslavia had decisively shifted in favor of the partisans. Ground operations soon followed. British and American commandos parachuted into Yugoslavia to train and fight alongside the partisans, transforming the once loosely organized guerrilla bands into a disciplined fighting force. Maclean frequently visited frontline units, inspecting troops and overseeing training exercises. The objective was clear: prepare the partisans to reclaim their country. Elsewhere in Europe, the tides of war were turning. In Italy, Allied forces pushed north, capturing Rome in June 1944. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army surged westward, reclaiming vast territories from German control. And on June 6, 1944, D-Day, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, opening a new front against Nazi Germany. As the war's end grew nearer, attention shifted to the post-war order. The shape of Europe was being redrawn even before the final battles were fought. Churchill decided it was time to meet Tito face-to-face. News of this impending meeting reached Maclean, who was stationed with Tito at a newly established partisan headquarters on the small Dalmatian island of Vis. The stage was set for a historic encounter between Britain's wartime leader and Yugoslavia's emerging strongman. A meeting that would not only shape the fate of Yugoslavia, but also leave an indelible mark on the post-war world. From the rugged hills of Yugoslavia, Fitzroy Maclean and Tito boarded a plane bound for the liberated Italian city of Naples. There, they would meet with Winston Churchill, the royalist Yugoslav government in exile, and senior Allied commanders. The stakes were high. This was more than a diplomatic meeting. It was an attempt to shape the future of Yugoslavia. On June 17, 1944, after tense negotiations, they appeared to reach an agreement. Tito pledged that once Yugoslavia was free, he would cooperate with the government in exile. Even more astonishing, he agreed that King Peter II could retain his crown. On the surface, it seemed like a diplomatic triumph. But beneath the formalities, one question lingered in Maclean's mind. Would Tito keep his word? By the autumn of 1944, the war in Yugoslavia was approaching its brutal climax. In September, Stalin's Red Army crossed the Yugoslav border, racing towards the capital, Belgrade. But they weren't the only force on the move. Tito's partisans had already gathered in strength on the outskirts of the city, poised for the final assault. As the German forces faced overwhelming pressure from both the Red Army and the partisans, they began a hasty retreat. Maclean, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity. He urged the partisans to strike hard as the Germans withdrew, aiming to disrupt their retreat and hasten Yugoslavia's liberation. The railway line near Leskovac in Serbia became their first target. Leaving Tito at his headquarters, Maclean assembled a mixed force of partisans and Allied operatives. Joining him were his trusted friend Randolph Churchill and an unlikely new recruit, Evelyn Waugh, the celebrated novelist who had traded his pen for a commando's rifle. As they approached Leskovac, Maclean called in Allied bombers to soften the target. The skies roared with the deafening thunder of engines as waves of bombers unleashed their deadly payloads. The ground trembled as explosions ripped through German supply lines, bridges, and railway tracks. With the Germans in disarray, Maclean led the ground assault, and the partisans surged forward, dismantling what remained of the enemy's grip on the region. All across Yugoslavia, the partisans were seizing control. Among their ranks was Bato Tomasevich, who had joined the resistance at just 15 years old. Thanks to the influx of British support, his unit advanced swiftly, liberating his hometown of Sednya in early October. Seeing the houses, including my own, and the familiar faces of people I knew, now dressed in British uniforms, armed with revolvers, bombs, machine guns, and caps bearing the Red Star. It was surreal, Bateau recalled. Someone joked, "Now you look like a Brit, except for the Red Star." His commander replied with a wry smile, "Don't worry. When the proletarian revolution succeeds, the British will be wearing the same Red Star as you." Just a few miles west of Sednya, Maclean and his men continued their march, scouting for new targets. But their advance was abruptly halted when a breathless messenger caught up with them, bearing alarming news. Tito had vanished from the island of Vis, their partisan stronghold. Maclean's instincts kicked in. He abandoned the mission and raced back to Vis to investigate. What he discovered was both baffling and deeply unsettling. An unidentified aircraft had landed on the island, stayed briefly, and then departed, with Tito on board. There were no clear records, no explanations, and no destination listed. Where had Tito gone? Maclean's mind raced with possibilities. Had Tito made a secret deal with Stalin? Was he negotiating a new alliance without Allied knowledge? Or was something even more sinister unfolding behind the scenes? The mystery of Tito's disappearance marked a turning point in the Allied partisan relationship. For Maclean, it was no longer just a mission to defeat the Germans. It was a race to uncover the true intentions of the man he had come to respect, yet never fully trust. Believing Tito had traveled inland to oversee the final push for Belgrade, Fitzroy Maclean wasted no time. Realizing the war was nearing its climax, he gathered a small team and raced toward the Yugoslav capital. They arrived as the battle raged to its bloody conclusion. Over 150,000 German soldiers, bolstered by anti-aircraft flotillas stationed along the Danube, mounted a desperate defense. But after 16 grueling days of relentless fighting, the combined forces of Tito's partisans and Stalin's Red Army broke through. On October 20th, 1944, Belgrade was liberated. The capital of Yugoslavia was free once more, a triumphant victory not just for the Red Army, but also for Tito, Maclean, and the partisans who had fought fiercely for their homeland. Yet the war was far from over. As the Germans retreated, they unleashed a scorched earth policy, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Villages were razed, infrastructure destroyed, and civilians massacred as the enemy fell back to defensive lines 30 miles north of Belgrade. Bato Tomasevich, now a battle-hardened teenager, was stationed in Belgrade. His unit's grim task was to identify and hunt down war criminals, armed with lists of names, photographs, and descriptions. But fate dealt him a cruel hand. While on patrol near the front lines, his unit accidentally crossed into German territory. Gunfire erupted. Their vehicle overturned in the chaos, and Tomasevich's head slammed against a jagged rock. He drifted into unconsciousness, barely aware as his comrades rushed him to a makeshift field hospital in the city. I remember the sensation of someone knocking on my skull, as if with a sharp object, he later recalled. When he awoke, the news was grim. His injuries were severe, and with medical supplies stretched thin, he'd have to wait his turn for treatment. But luck, or perhaps fate, intervened. Her name was Stana Tomasevich, Bato's sister, a fierce leader of one of the partisan youth brigades. When she heard of her brother's injuries, she raced to his side. Using her influence, she ensured he received immediate medical attention, even donating her own blood to save his life. After 3 agonizing months, Bato began to recover. The war was ending, but for him, and for Yugoslavia, a new chapter was just beginning. "I am proud to have fought with the partisans," Bato later reflected. "Perhaps I didn't contribute much, but my family did. My brother paid with his life. My entire family suffered, but it was for Yugoslavia's freedom. That freedom had come at an enormous cost. Nearly 250,000 partisans had died, and over 400,000 were wounded in the fight to reclaim their country." A week after Belgrade's liberation, Maclean finally found Tito, not on the front lines as he had assumed, but secluded in a villa on the city's outskirts. The truth was startling. Tito hadn't been in Belgrade at all. He had traveled to Moscow, where he'd met with Stalin himself, receiving direct instructions from the Soviet leader. With his new mandate in hand, Tito made his move. He reneged on the deal he had made in Naples, announcing that he would lead Yugoslavia as its sole ruler. There would be no place for King Peter II or the exiled government. Yugoslavia was now firmly on the path to becoming the communist state Maclean had long feared. The question that haunted Allied leaders in 1945 was clear. To what extent would Tito take orders from Moscow? Much had changed since 1937, when Tito had been summoned to the Soviet capital and appointed Secretary General of the Yugoslav Communist Party. Over the course of the war, he had endured the horrors of battle, survived impossible odds, and built from scratch a formidable political and military machine. He had tasted the intoxicating triumph of victory, and he knew the power it brought. When the dust settled, he could rightfully claim that it was his forces, not the Soviets, who had driven the Germans from Yugoslavia. But the first signs of his leadership were troubling. Tito launched a brutal campaign of retribution against his former rivals, the Chetniks. On March 13, 1946, Draza Mihailovic, the once favored royalist leader, was captured. His trial began on June 10th, charged with collaborating with the Germans. His defense was simple. He claimed he had been forced into impossible choices, trying to protect his men and keep all options open. But the verdict was swift. Mihailovic was found guilty and sentenced to death. Across the Atlantic, Churchill watched these developments with growing unease. In 1946, he delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech, warning the world of the expanding shadow of communism across Europe. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. The communist parties that had once been insignificant were now in power, seeking totalitarian control. The question lingered. Had Churchill and Maclean made a grave mistake by backing Tito? Should they have continued to support Mihailovic after all? The decision seemed even more perplexing when new revelations surfaced about the intelligence reports that had influenced Churchill's choice. In 1942, James Klugman, a British intelligence officer stationed in Cairo, had compiled the reports that ultimately swayed British support from Mihailovic to Tito. It was later discovered that Klugman's assessments were biased. He had been a committed communist sympathizer all along. In the end, the fate of Yugoslavia and the role Britain played in shaping it was a story of wartime alliances, ideological gambles, and the unforeseen consequences of choosing the lesser evil. Maclean had fulfilled his mission, but the Yugoslavia he helped liberate was not the one he had hoped to see. James Klugman, the British intelligence officer whose reports had shaped Allied support for Tito, had exaggerated both the number of partisans under Tito's command and the effectiveness of their attacks against the Axis. It wasn't until 2002 that the full truth emerged. Klugman had been a devout communist, with ties to the infamous Cambridge spy ring from his university days, an espionage network that had quietly infiltrated British intelligence during the war. Despite Fitzroy Maclean's lingering fears that Yugoslavia would fall under Moscow's grip, behind the Iron Curtain Churchill famously warned about, history took an unexpected turn. Tito would defy the Soviet Union, charting an independent course that set Yugoslavia apart from its communist neighbors. Unlike the oppressive regimes of Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia under Tito grew more peaceful, stable, and even prosperous. In a way, this unexpected outcome may have been influenced, at least in part, by the wartime efforts of Churchill and Maclean. In the long term, a historian later observed, the connection Tito had with Churchill during the war encouraged him to believe that Yugoslavia didn't have to live under Stalin's heel. And when Stalin tried to bully him, Tito simply stood his ground. For a man born into a nation fractured by deep ethnic, religious, and linguistic divisions, Josip Broz Tito achieved the seemingly impossible. Through his unique brand of communism, he united Yugoslavia's diverse peoples, keeping the fragile peace for over 30 years. Tito had seized power after 3.5 years of brutal warfare, much of it fought against fellow Yugoslavs, but he remained in control, even as the Soviet Union made repeated efforts to undermine him. He was a revolutionary with a revolutionary program, one commentator noted. Much of his life was spent, both figuratively and literally, on the barricades. Tito's legacy became even more striking in the years following his death in 1980. Within just 11 years, Yugoslavia, once held together by his iron will, began to unravel, descending into a series of bloody conflicts that would tear the country apart. As for Fitzroy Maclean, he returned to Britain after the war, resuming his seat in the House of Commons. But his heart remained tied to Yugoslavia, and he carried a deep respect for Tito until the end of his life. His bond with Yugoslavia wasn't just political, it was personal. Maclean eventually crossed paths with Beto Tomasevich, the young partisan who had fought, bled, and survived the horrors of war. But Beto's story didn't end on the battlefields of Yugoslavia. He carved out an extraordinary path of his own, becoming a diplomat in Tito's government. Incredibly, he was also one of the few survivors of the tragic 1958 Munich air disaster, which claimed the lives of many of Manchester United's legendary Busby Babes. Maclean and Tomasevich remained friends for the rest of Maclean's life, a testament to the enduring human connections forged in the crucible of war. He was proud, Tomasevich later said, and pleased that he could contribute to Yugoslavia. And he did make a great contribution. Without Fitzroy, it would not have been the same place. In the end, both Tito and Maclean left indelible marks on history. One as a revolutionary who defied empires, the other as an unlikely diplomat and soldier whose courage and diplomacy helped shape a nation's destiny. Their story is a testament to the complex, often contradictory alliances that emerge in the fog of war, and the unexpected friendships that outlast even the fiercest battles.